So yeah, David's always asking good questions here. And this time he says, I'm working on a bit of a different idea recently. Usually David, yeah, he's asking about the Catalan. But this time, let's see, it says, I'm looking to become a bit less predictable, so I've started mixing some Sicilian into my repertoire. That's great. Sicilian's a very nice opening. I definitely highly recommend people to play the Sicilian. It's just fun. It's just more fun than a lot of the other options. Okay, that people are choosing. Anyway, I played the dragon against the open, but what can I do against the Alapin, the C3 Sicilian, which seems more common at lower levels? Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Let's go to the board. So the Alapin Sicilian, aka the C3 Sicilian, is pretty popular. I would say it's one of the more popular sidelines that folks will typically face when playing the Sicilian. I know when I was doing the Sicilian speed run, I would probably get C3 Sicilians like every other game or so. So yeah, they're very, very common, along with other sidelines like the close Sicilian or like knight C3 followed by G3, and then building up with this kind of setup, and then also like the Grand Prix attack, I would say is pretty common at lower levels as well. So yeah, C3 Sicilian is a very logical choice. I played this a couple times when I was just starting out, and yeah, the idea is very simple. White just wants to capture the full center and not let black exchange off their C pawn for one of white's center pawns. Right, the whole idea behind the Sicilian is to try to get an extra center pawn for black. So here white fights against this, and there's essentially two main approaches I think that are very, very solid and will take a player a long way. Personally, I've always liked playing knight f6 in this position, so attacking the pawn and not giving white a chance to establish the full center with d4, because the e pawn will be hanging. Typically, white advances here with e5, because if they just like defend the pawn with like d3 or something, well then they're kind of not really achieving their main idea of c3, right, which is to push for d4. And I think black is already fine. You can go e5 and just develop your pieces, fight for the center, and everything is pretty solid here. So I've always liked this one because it provokes white to advance with e5, which players usually do, and then black gets this really nice square on d5 for the knight. Where if white just like continues to kick the knight with like c4, then again they're giving up this d4 idea, and then they're really going to be weak on the dark squares here. So black drops back, like let's say knight c7, and then this knight comes out, and then this knight can come to e6, and then black just gets total control over this d4 square. So what usually happens in this line is white plays d4. They kind of take over the center, but the point is that black was able to establish this really nice outpost on d5, and then after black plays e6 here and d6, I've always felt like this is kind of a very playable structure for black, where it's kind of like an isolated queen pawn type of position where white is often going to be having a weak pawn or two in the center, but on the flip side, white will get certain attacking chances on the king side. So I've always liked these setups, like with d6 here. Let's say white plays knight f3, black goes d6, bishop e7, castles, and so on. The light squared bishop can go to b7, where it's placed really, really nicely on this diagonal. And yeah, strategically, I've just always really liked black's chances in these structures. This knight usually going to d7. So this is definitely one option. I would definitely say this one is maybe more suited for higher rated players, because white does get certain attacking chances here, and not everyone wants to just be like defending their king as black. So personally, I feel fine in this kind of position, and I would definitely recommend it, but yeah, it might not be everyone's cup of tea. So my main recommendation actually would be to just play d5 here, and this is the other kind of tried and tested way for black to deal with the c3 Sicilian. You can see like both of these methods, they're like both attacking the e4 square, which is kind of important. And with d5, what black essentially does is kind of forces white to take on d5. Because if e5 here, then knight c6, and black gets beautiful control over the center, and the bishop can still come out, and black can just get a fantastic French and just stand really, really comfortably. So after d5, this kind of like delayed Scandinavian approach, queen takes d5. Of course, the big point is that white is committed to this c3 move and can't challenge this queen on d5. So black's queen on d5 actually stands quite well. And yeah, I would say this one is a little bit easier for black compared to the knight of 6 lines. Objectively, they both stand absolutely fine, and they're both being played by top players. But I would say this one is maybe a little bit simpler for black to play, so I would probably recommend this. What usually happens here is at a certain point, white's going to go d4, and eventually black will take on d4 and leave white with an isolated queen pawn. And it's definitely not the end of the world for white. It's a very, very playable structure, but I've always felt like these structures are a little bit easier for black to play. Black kind of has less to prove, not having to babysit this weakness. So there's a couple different setups here that black can try. I looked at things a little bit. I think the easiest is to go knight c6 here, just putting pressure on the pawn. Usually white will play knight f3, then knight f6, just bringing the other knight out. And depending on what white does here, black can either play bishop g4 next move, and even think about castling queenside and playing very actively and putting pressure against this d-pawn. Or black can play much more solid with a move like e6, bishop e7, and then castling kingside. So, for example, if white goes bishop e2 here, then I would say e6 is a good approach here. Bishop g4, a little bit less effective when white has already kind of can immediately kind of challenge this bishop with h3. So I would say e6, castles, let's say bishop e7, and yeah, I think black is totally fine here. If white takes on c5, we can take with the queen or trade queens and take with the bishop. Essentially, it's a very solid position. Black just needs to castle, get the bishop out, probably to like b6, bishop b7 would be the normal way, or somehow bishop d7, bishop c6. And yeah, strategically, I think black is doing really well here. So this is kind of like one just sample line. I also want to note, like a lot of players as white, they like to try out these like tricky knight a3 moves with the idea of looking for like knight to b5 and then looking for some kind of fork on c7 or maybe getting a tempo with bishop to c4. And here I would say this one is really nicely dealt with bishop to g4. So this is kind of an idea I want to highlight. Just putting pressure on the knight and also putting a lot of pressure on the d-pawn. And if white plays knight to b5 here, threatening a very unpleasant knight c7 check, here black can just castle, and white just doesn't have enough development here to really do anything on the queen side. Black is way ahead in development. We can play like a6 to kick the knight away. We're threatening to take on d4 and essentially just crash through in the center already. So I think black is doing really well here. So this is kind of a cool idea to keep in mind. But yeah, essentially knight c6, knight f6. I think most players will probably just go bishop e2 here, and then e6, bishop comes out, castles. Another approach is to just take on d4 here. And after c takes d4, bishop e7, black is just going to be playing against the isolated queen pawn. Once again, the bishop wants to get to b7. We have this d5 square. White can, of course, play knight c3 and challenge our queen. And the main thing to kind of remember is that the queen in these positions usually goes to d6. It looks a little bit in the way, but I think it's actually quite normally placed here. It covers some squares. And once again, the main idea for black is to just get the bishop to b7. Eventually, the rooks can come to the center, and we're just playing against this weak pawn. We're trying to trade off minor pieces. And yeah, the more pieces we exchange, the less attacking chances white has. So that's kind of the general strategic idea about this position, or these types of positions, that I think is probably even more important to understand and internalize than any of these individual lines. You're playing against the weak pawn in the center. You're trying to trade minor pieces, win that pawn eventually, and then win some kind of pawn up endgame. That's the game plan. Good luck. All right, so I think that'll do it. Long story short, d5 here is simple and straightforward. Knight f6 also very interesting, especially if black wants kind of a more dynamic position. This is also totally playable. Okay, David, hopefully that helps. Let's go to the next question.